Welcome to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, Ciaran O'Connor. I'm joined today by my co-host. You have heard from him before, Mr. Gregory Steinbrecher. Greg, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Ciaran. How you doing?
I'm doing well. As we said before the podcast, I'm employed and I'm healthy, and so I'm counting my blessings. We have a very special guest today, and I'll let Greg do the honors of introducing him because I think Greg has been a longtime admirer of his work. But first, I just wanted to provide a brief update to our listeners because it is a big week for Braver Angels. We're about 30 days from the election, and Americans are increasingly concerned that the country will see an increase in violence as a result of the election. We all feel this, but Braver Angels wanted to actually probe this question. We commissioned a poll with YouGov, and the results are striking. 56% of Americans across party lines expect there to be an increase in violence as a result of the election. About half of respondents also questioned the fairness of the election, as well as the legitimacy of the election. Will Americans agree on who is the legitimately elected president of the United States? It is within that context that Braver Angels has released a letter, a public letter called What We Will Do to Hold America Together. We are inviting millions of Americans, everyone and their mother, to sign this letter if they believe in the work of Braver Angels, if they believe in fighting hard for their candidate, but also embracing a higher partisanship that seeks to hold the country together and that would reject the violence that some have called for. So that provides fertile ground for us to jump into this topic. Greg, I'll turn things over to you. Who do we have here today?
Sure. Today, we are very lucky to be joined by David French, a senior editor at the Dispatch, formerly of National Review, I believe a major in the Army during the Iraq War.
When I was deployed as a captain, and when I got out of the Army as a major, yeah.
I see. And Harvard Law graduate, and recently out with a new book called Divided We Fall, which is incredibly relevant to what we do at Braver Angels. So, David, before we leap into things, would you mind talking about what the book is about?
Yeah, so the book begins with the simple declaration that the continued unity of the United States of America cannot be guaranteed, and that there is no single important cultural, political, religious, or social force that's pulling Americans together more than it's pushing us apart. And so it's designed to be an alarm bell, basically, to say, we cannot keep doing this, especially we cannot keep doing this when we amplify our differences with hatred. And that history teaches us that there are natural consequences when nations grow, when the people of a nation grow apart so decisively. And so trying to wake people up, basically, that we cannot continue to seek to dominate. We have to find a way to accommodate, or we could face a catastrophe.
So what would you say is different about this moment in time? What separates it from, say, the late 18th century or the 1960s, when partisan rancor was pretty high? Domestic terrorism in the 1960s was much higher than it is today. But these did not lead to a civil war. So what makes you think that what conditions exist today that make you say that this is different?
Well, basically what we have today is different in many material ways from the conditions in previous times of upheaval. What we are dividing on essentially every important basis. So I walk through all of the elements in the first part of the book. So we have a big sort geographically that did not exist in the 1960s. A very big sort geographically, where Americans are tending to live around people of like mind to such a degree, to a greater degree than any time since we've been measuring it in the modern era. And that's accelerating. In 2016, it was the highest percentage of Americans that we've measured who lived in so-called landslide counties, where one county or another wins, or one candidate or another wins by 20 points or more. So we're living around people of like mind. We're consuming dramatically different popular culture. We are, and that pop culture differences often map on political, across political differences. They reinforce political differences. They're reflected in political differences. We are becoming a country that is both highly religious and more secular. And those religious differences are also mapping onto the partisan map quite precisely. And then when people of like mind gather, what tends to happen, and this is an important concept I discuss at the book from Cass Sunstein, that people grow more extreme. When people of like mind gather, they get more extreme. They don't get more moderate. And so you have these super clusters of Americans living in specific geographic areas, growing more extreme and more apart, and also hating each other more. That's another factor that we found, is that the amount of enmity that Americans have for their political opponents is ever increasing. This isn't just an elite phenomenon. It's a widespread social phenomenon where people are hating each other more and more. So when you have geographic clusters of like-minded Americans who are growing more different from each other on virtually every materials part of this cultural, political, religious spectrum, it creates a threat of instability. And this is something we've seen happen before in American history, when geographic clusters believe that their culture is under threat. And we've seen it in world history. And so what I'm saying is that this is not the 1960s. This is not the 1960s. There are a lot of things happening together at once that are making this something different.
Okay. So on that, there's been an interesting response to your book that I've noted in a few places, which is from both sides a questioning of perhaps why a division of the United States would be so bad. F.H. Buckley in Law and Liberty approached that from the right, Joshua Keating in Slate from the left, and there had been an article in New York Magazine a few years ago that sort of imagined what this new America might look like. And there is a part of me that doesn't agree with the conclusion, but they are operating from the same premises. And there's something seductive about the conclusion, that there's this great Gordian knot of seemingly intractable problems. So why don't we just take a sword to it and let the chips fall where they may? But what would you say in response to people who go, you know what, if we seem to be heading that way, why don't we just go?
Yeah, it's funny because, one critique that I've gotten is, wait a minute, is this something that people are actually thinking about? And then I read things that say, hey, wait a minute, this wouldn't actually be so bad, which reaffirms sort of my thesis that we're growing apart so decisively that some people are now openly saying, would this be a bad thing? I have kind of two answers to this. One is principled, one is pragmatic. And the principled answer is that, look, the American idea is a good and virtuous idea on its own terms. This 1-2 punch of the aspiration of the Declaration of Independence, which is, that our creators endowed us with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Governments are secured, exist among men to secure these liberties. And that is the aspiration becomes operationalized through the marvels of the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments. And our American history has been a long march towards trying to realize these ideals. These ideals are good ideals. These are good and true. And a society that is built around those ideals is the best we as human beings have been able to come up with for a body politic. And so we shouldn't give up on that. And anyone who believes that in the incredible stress of a separation of a nation, that you're going to create separate and better nations based on better ideals, seems kind of speculative to me. And then the other thing is, and I lay this out in one of my, I have the books in 3 parts. One is why we're not getting any better, how, and part 2 are fictionalized scenarios of how we could split apart. And part 3 is what we can do about it. And as I lay out in one of those scenarios, the removal of this incredible economic and military hyperpower from the world stage would mean sort of the return of a lot of the most dangerous parts of world history with a vengeance, including great power conflict, great power struggles, economic disruptions. And so if you like kind of the world as we know it, then you should like having the United States of America. So it's a nation built on certain ideals that are good, and it's a nation that is doing great good in the world by its very existence and power. And so to eliminate both of those elements, both the ideals and the existence, would create chaos, uncertainty, and I'm not so sure that the other countries that emerge would be better than what we have now. And there's a lot of reasons to believe they'd be worse.
One question I have, David, you mentioned the potential binary between domination and accommodation. Mm-hmm. And putting on my liberal hat, or the hat that some of my progressive friends wear, they might say something like, well, I don't believe in violence, and I'm not telling people to go out in the streets, but the last thing we need to do is accommodate. We need to roundly beat the Republicans who have used the structure of our democracy to advance minoritarian rule and given rise to a populace who is, destroying the heart of this country. And not that we necessarily need to dominate citizen to citizen, but now is not the time to apologize or enable or accommodate. Now is the time to pack the court. Now is the time to win and redistrict. And now is the time to cement majority's majority. How do you respond to that argument, which is certainly ascendant on the left?
Well, so you have two issues here. One, if you had to peg the biggest concern of people on the left right now, I would say it might be minoritarian rule. That, the realities of the Electoral College, the changing sort of population demographics of the country mean that it's very possible for a more effective politician than Donald Trump, and perhaps even Donald Trump again in 2020, to cement and to create an environment where a minority of America sort of has a default advantage in the American system, and that this minoritarian control is a real threat to democracy. So that's a progressive concern. Here's a conservative concern: majoritarian tyranny. So if you say, okay, well, we'll beat Donald Trump, fine, I want Donald Trump gone. If you say, okay, now we're going to pack the court and get rid of basic religious liberty protections, wait a second. We're going to, get rid of some of the or water down or get rid of some of the intentionally counter-majoritarian designed elements of the Constitution. Hold on, because this country was designed with the reality that it has to protect minorities. This system has to protect minorities, or it's not going to be stable. And in fact, some of our greatest instability has occurred when we haven't protected minorities. For example, the failure to protect, African Americans, and the persistence of slavery led to the bloodiest war in the history of the United States. And so, there's a beat Donald Trump, sure, but then to sort of say, well, here's what we're going to do because we've won. We're going to do what we want on some of these sort of core civil liberties areas. You're going to get massive pushback to that, just massive pushback. And so that's what I mean when I say we have to seek to accommodate people who have competing values in this system. And if we don't, if we try to dominate people who have competing values, it's not that people will reject their values and say, you're right, you won 54% of the vote, I don't value my liberty anymore, here it is. What the reality of human beings is, sometimes people are at their most dangerous when they feel like they're most threatened. And this idea, especially when you have giant geographic clustering, that you can say to whole sections of the country, we won, you lost. That's elections have consequences. Too bad. Progressives don't like that right now. Trump won under the rules, and he's doing everything he can under the existing rule. I mean, he's jamming through a Supreme Court nominee at the very last minute while votes are being counted in defiance of, many of the statements that Republicans made in 2016. And look, I mean, at some point, somebody's got to stop saying, I'm going to do what I have the power to do. And that's going to be the prime consideration. What we have to do is have considerations of prudence, pluralism. Can we allow individuals with competing value systems to flourish in this country? And if the answer is, well, you know, I mean, you can if you win an election. That's not the answer our founders intended, particularly the wisest of the founders. And if we default to that, it's just a never-ending race towards grasping power.
So what would you say to somebody who would, I was talking to a friend of mine about the Second Amendment recently, and he said, we don't need it because we're not in danger anymore of governments, you know, attacking the people. That's so outside the realm of possibility that we don't need to protect ourselves from a dangerous state. And so I wonder, you know, let's say you could have two different countries that have similar ideals, but they just manifest in different ways. So let's say, okay, we have, you know, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but on one side of the country, that's going to manifest with universal health care, no guns, and, you know, a woman's right to choose, while on this side of the country, it'll manifest with, you know, free markets and no abortion and easy access to guns. Does that necessarily put the ideals under threat?
Well, the core of the solution set of my book is that we should be able to create and form communities that express and enact our political values. That one of the problems that we have for polarization is that because of the increasing centralization of the United States government, the United States government is taking outsized influence on our lives. But at the same time, because of the realities of the system, which have led to an awful lot of gridlock, and also due to the realities of American divisions in many ways, what ends up happening is the federal government is becoming increasingly powerful at the exact moment when most Americans have increasingly little say in its operation. So if you live in the most powerful branch of government is the executive branch. That was never the intent of the founders. The intent of the founders is the most powerful branch is the representative branch, the House of Representatives and the Senate. That the legislative branch is the most powerful branch. Not unchecked power, but it's the most powerful branch. What's upside down? The president is the most powerful branch. I live in Tennessee. I do not cast a meaningful vote for president. I don't. I never have. I never have. In fact, I've only lived in dark blue and dark red states in my entire life. And I am 51 years old. I have never cast a vote that mattered for the most powerful branch of government. That is deeply alienating and frustrating. And so what I say is we need to de-escalate national politics. And what we need to do is bring as much of the meaningful government to people's lives as close as possible to where people live, to governments that can be quite responsive to the desires of citizens. In fact, almost 80% of Americans right now, because of our clustering, live in states with one-party rule, where there is the upper house, the lower house, and the governor are all held by the same party. Almost 80% of Americans live in that circumstance. There's one state in the union with divided legislature, one, and that's Minnesota. So most people live in a place where if there was the greater ability to form a polity that expressed your values, it's right there. It's laying right there. But we have enormous amount of centralization occurring right as we also have an increasing amount of diversity. So as Americans are becoming more different, our government is becoming more centralized, and that creates inherent tension. Now, the interesting thing about guns is the difference with guns and some of the other things on the list is that the Second Amendment is in the Bill of Rights. So if you're talking about fundamental American liberties, I don't think federalism works if you have one set of Bill of Rights for people in one state and another set of Bill of Rights for people in other states. That disparate application of fundamental American liberties has been destabilizing. But on the gun point, right now, the actual holding of the Supreme Court is that you have a right to possess a handgun in the home for personal defense. gun laws all over the rest of America are highly federalist, highly. So we actually do have a federalism system when it comes to gun rights. It's just that the gun rights argument has by and large won almost everywhere, except in a few states. So we do have a pretty federalist system already with gun rights. And the Supreme Court has shown no real indication that it's keen on changing that right now. So if you live in a state that has expansive gun rights, that is not secured by the federal courts right now. It is not. It is secured by your state legislature. So there's already a pretty high degree of federalism. There's just a lot of frustration on the part of progressives in that in a lot of otherwise sort of purplish states, they have not prevailed in gun rights, in gun rights battles in state government.
Yeah, I definitely share the frustration about feeling like my vote doesn't count. I mean, being in New York, a heavily blue state, you know, if Biden wins New York by 1 point or 15 points, he gets the same amount of electoral votes. Or,
right.
You know, if Trump loses by 1 point, that 49%, you know, doesn't really matter. So how do you react to the idea of electoral college reform?
Well, you know, I feel the way about electoral college reform, the way I feel about a lot of things that would require constitutional amendment. If you get the sufficient supermajorities to achieve the constitutional amendment, you have achieved a level of national consensus that says that some of the underlying divisions in the U.S. no longer exist. Because the last thing red states are going to agree to right now is to relinquish their disproportionate power in rural states under the Electoral College. That's the last thing they're going to do. And some of these legislative solutions are a little bit of thin gruel. So can you imagine a situation where, say, you have a Democratic legislature that says, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have this legislative reform that says that our electors go to the winner of the popular vote only,
right?
Not to the winner of the state vote. And then it turns out that a person of the opposite party is winning the popular vote. And contrary to your own state's vote, at what speed would that legislature repeal that law? Because there is no way they're going to allow their state's votes to be disregarded, the way their state has voted to be disregarded to elect somebody of the opposing party. So a lot of that stuff is a little bit of vaporware. So my argument is, look, if you're banking on a constitutional amendment to break the logjam, you're betting on the logjam to be broken before the amendment passes. So what is it that we can do within the existing constitutional structure to deal with this? And look, I'm more than happy to talk about constitutional amendments sort of as what are constitutional best practices going forward if we ever do achieve a degree of unanimity and unity again that would be sufficient to create systemic change. These are arguments and discussions worth having, but in the present time period, they're kind of like dorm room arguments in the sense that in a world that's not our world, what would this help? But in our world where we can't do these things, what is it we can do to actually de-escalate and to sort of stop this endless spiral of partisan rage and anger?
So, Mr. French, I want to go back to something you said earlier about a decentralized populace living under a more centralized government. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading, this was explored book length by Yuval Levin's The Fractured Republic, and I remember reading that and wondering, it felt like these were structural forces outside of my control that were going to just take form however they did, and so I'm curious how much of this is sort of a spasm that's happening because there's a lot of structural change happening all at once, and how much of this current moment is due to our own actions and responsibilities, and what can we do to make this polarization better?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it that is not our own actions and responsibilities. A lot of it is are the natural consequences of historical and technological developments. So if you're going to have the ability to have an unprecedented amount of choice in media, I mean, what are people going to do? Say, nope, for our own good, we need 3 networks again. People are going to say, no, I like the menu of stuff on Netflix. Or if you have an increasingly diverse, racially, ethnically, religiously, continent-sized republic that no longer faces the kind of existential threat that we faced first in World War II, or the economic existential threat we faced in the Great Depression, or the existential threat from the rivalry with Soviet communism. So we don't have that external uniting force. We are going to sort of revert to type, which is, in the absence of the external uniting force, we're going to sort of see the divisions that we have with each other in sharper relief. So a lot of this stuff is just the natural reaction of big historical trends that we are then making worse by our own voluntary actions. And so there's a world in which increasing differences are not seen as threatening. They might be seen as curious. They might be seen as interesting. They might be seen as odd. Like if I go to Belgium, for example, and I see, the culture of Belgium, I don't feel threatened by it. It's like, oh, that's interesting. I'm just glad I don't live in Belgium. I mean, Belgium's perfectly nice, but I'm glad I like Tennessee. So there are things we're used to in other countries, seeing differences and cultural differences and perceiving them to be interesting. And not threatening. Like I don't feel threatened by Canadian culture. I like Canada. It's a fun place to go, fun place to visit. But a lot of us, because of the structure of this country, they look at California, if you're in Tennessee, and they see California as threatening, that the ideas of California governance are threatening. And people from California, because of our highly centralized system, look, bottom line is Ted Cruz, if you're from California, Ted Cruz has too much say over your life. And if you're from Texas, Dianne Feinstein has too much say over your life. And so what that ends up meaning is that some of this American diversity isn't seen as interesting. It isn't seen as kind of part of this fascinating American tapestry of different cultures and subcultures. Instead, it's seen as a clear and present danger to my culture. The existence of this other powerful culture is seen as a clear and present danger to my culture. And that's where this sense of enmity and rage and fear is building. And look, it is entirely possible that if this is allowed to sort of play out its natural course without people blundering or behaving opportunistically or maliciously, that what you have is this historical phase. And we look back at it and say, I remember the great fragmentation of 1990 to 2030, followed by the unification of 2035 behind this unanticipated historical or technological force. But the problem is, when you go through tumultuous times and you combine it with rage and enmity and poor leadership, you create a real chance that this spasm or this period becomes not just a phase, but a catastrophe.
I know it can be somewhat of a cliche and a convenient scapegoat to go after the media, mm-hmm. but at least in talking to Braver Angels members, it comes up a lot. Conservatives seem to feel that the popular narrative is out of their control, while liberals feel like conservatives are being fed untrue propaganda. What role do you think the media has? I know you work for the Dispatch, and that's trying to sort of carve out a different way of doing things that is not only responsible but profitable. I was wondering if you could sort of elaborate more on the media's responsibility in all this. Is it given too much of the blame by most people?
It's definitely given too much blame. It's definitely. I mean, everybody is getting. So let me put it this way: the media has problems. I mean, there's no question about it. But does the media occupy the central place in the story of American division in quite the same way that it should? No, I'll tell you who should occupy the central place in the story of American division. It's the American people. Okay. It's the American people. One of the interesting things about about our American Republic is, look, there's sort of this ironclad view on the part of an awful lot of people that the American people cannot fail. They can only be failed. Okay. And so if there's a problem in our society, well, it's those darn politicians. If there's a problem in our media, it's that darn media. Doesn't mean that there aren't politicians who are problematic. There are. I look at Donald Trump, for example, as he's like a symptom that makes the underlying disease worse, in the way sort of like a hacking cough can break a rib. The media is in many ways also similar. It's like a symptom that makes the underlying disease worse. But look, John Adams had it right in the letter to the Massachusetts militia that this republic, and I think he could have phrased it better. I think he said, our constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It's wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. And the problem with that phrase is religion is not always correlated with morality. So I would say the best way to say it is the Constitution was made for a moral people. It is wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. And so we cannot hate people and claim that we're being failed. We cannot be almost criminally underinformed about the basic civic realities of our country and continue to claim that the real problem is we're being failed. And so a constitutional republic requires a certain basic level of virtue and sense of responsibility in its citizens. And so, yeah, I mean, I am a critic of the media, but I'm really quite tired of every scandal eventually devolves into a media scandal somehow, because somebody is watching it. I mean, nobody is taking my face and jamming it in front of a fake news site and saying, read this. No, it is satisfying something that I want to see. Or nobody is saying to a person, a progressive living in a progressive bubble, to don't leave your comfort zone and only rely on what, like, for example, Jezebel tells you about those awful Christians. The people have responsibilities to be informed, curious, virtuous, and we cannot keep deflecting to somebody else all of our nation's problems. But there's not much of a market for that argument, because what politician is going to be elected by saying, hey guys, we got to be better? And by we, I mean y'all too. And because everything feeds into the narrative of you can't fail, you can only be failed.
So what do you see as potential solutions, or at least potential ameliorative forces? I mean, at Braver Angels, we find hope in the face-to-face, or now Zoom-to-Zoom citizen interaction. But obviously that's hard to scale. So as you've been thinking and writing about this, where do you find hope? What do you think we should invest more into? What can we focus on, not just over the next 30 days, but over the next 30 years, as we think about combating polarization and also casting a more affirmative vision of the pursuit of a more perfect union and the better realization of those ideals?
Yeah. So in a weird way, misery creates hope, in the sense that people do not like to be miserable. They do not, as a general, like to be angry all of the time. Now, it can be the case that you can make terrible mistakes before you sort of hit rock bottom and seek something better. But the American people do have this interesting pattern of reversing course. And so that's a reason for hope. It's not a plan. You can't sort of say, my plan is that the American people will get tired of this and then they'll reverse course and sort of have a reawakened sense of fellow feeling and civic responsibility and regard for the humanity of their opponents. That's not a plan. That's a hope. But the plan to make that happen involves a lot of what you guys do. I agree. I totally agree that it's difficult to scale, but what can scale is the effective leaders. What does scale is the effective leaders. And if you get key cultural leaders and pull them out of this incredible zero-sum partisan rage, that has a ripple effect. It has a ripple effect, just as it has a ripple effect when key leaders are constantly stoking that rage. And so one of the things that I call for in the book are better leaders, to be honest, people who see the humanity in their opponents, people who resist the temptation to dehumanize, this sort of tendency towards seeing your opponents as morally defective, when the reality is, you know, we're all fallen human beings and we all have our responsibilities. But the idea that you can sit there and classify your side as the side of the angels and their side as the side of the devils basically requires you to not understand anything about their mindset, to almost be like sort of deliberately ignorant of their mindset. And so we do need a class of better leaders, I believe. And I call for that in the very last chapter of the book. And it requires some courage, I think. And it requires sort of stepping out in front of the train of polarization and saying, stop. But also at the same time, there are some structural things that we can do. As I've talked about, one of the things we can do to turn down the temperature is make our elections, our national elections, matter a little bit less by pushing down governance to a closer and more local level. You know, it's overdone to say that every election is the most important election of our lifetime. How many times we've heard, I've heard that almost every election of my lifetime. And it is true that some elections are more important than others, although you often don't know that until which ones are truly important until sort of years of hindsight. But what is true is that every election is electing, in all likelihood, the most powerful central government, peacetime central government in American history, with a smaller and smaller percentage of Americans casting decisive votes. That is destabilizing. That's alienating. That is frustrating. And so the more we can do to take that power and devolve it down to where you feel like you have a say in the creation of and the perpetuation of the values of your own community, I think the better off we are. So better leaders, a call for individual tolerance, where we model the political values we would like to see in our society. A lot of people on both sides are super angry and vicious, with this sort of unspoken promise that, hey, if we finally win, then everything will be okay. But all that anger and viciousness says is if we win, angry, vicious people win. And so modeling the kinds of values that you would seek to be perpetuated in the American body politic, I think that's critical. So all of those things together, but none of them create a utopia. There's always going to be tensions. I like the way the pseudonymous writer Scott Alexander described small L liberalism and pluralism. He called it the best Civil War avoidance mechanism created by the mind of man. Note, he didn't say utopia creating mechanism. He said Civil War avoidance mechanism. And so we're always going to have tension. We're always going to have disagreement, and a lot of us aren't going to like each other. But the bottom line is, with a basic level of tolerance and by respecting each other's civil liberties, this whole thing can keep on going and lead to an awful lot of human flourishing.
I have a couple of follow-ups to ask about that. The first is, I think localism, smaller government, federalism has become associated with one political side of the spectrum, little less so the party that's been associated with that political side of the spectrum. But how can you convince, in an age of negative polarization, how can you convince people that this is a bipartisan structural solution, not a Trojan horse to a conservative policy agenda? And on that, with the localism, this is something I've been curious about. If, we want people to sort of get together more locally, but and sort of join mediating institutions, but those local places are more and more homogenous because of the big sort. Is there a danger of that creating that amplifying effect that we're talking about?
Well, the amplifying effect, I think, is happening no matter. There's a lot of evidence that people are they just keep on migrating to where they feel most comfortable. I think there's a key phrase you used in there, smaller government, that I would dispute under my formulation. Localism does not necessarily mean smaller government. It might mean smaller federal government, but one of the chapters in my book was originally entitled "How California Single Payer Could Save America." And so if you had, and the reasoning was, there was an overwhelming majority vote, at least early on in California, for a single payer plan to at least, let's look at this, let's study this. And this is a long-held view of people on the left, and a long-held hope of people on the left in this country. And what they realized is the only way they could do it financially, the only way this could work, is if the federal government sort of allowed California to opt out of funneling all of so much of its funds and money into the federal system, and allowed them to have waivers, which would allow California to claw back a lot of its money, so that it could then pour into a single payer plan. That's not smaller government. That's progressive government. But it's progressive government in California, not in Tennessee. And that waiver process, which would allow California to sort of opt out of a lot of federal mandates, would then presumably be able to extend to other states that could fashion their own solution. And so I think one of the things you have to show with federalism is that it's not a Trojan horse for conservatism. It's a vehicle for your values in your state. Now, but if one of the reasons why federal sort of smaller government as a catchphrase has been seen as a Trojan horse is because if you have smaller government, that might mean it's starved of funds. It's not able to even do bigger things if it wanted to. But local government and smaller government are not the same thing. Localism is not the same thing as shrinking government more broadly. It's relocating government, and where it might shrink in one place, it might grow in another. And interestingly, I have talked to a lot of progressives who've sort of seen new virtues in federalism during the Trump administration. But what we have to do is get beyond federalism as a tactic, because everybody loves federalism when they're not in power. Then when they get power, they don't like federalism. Stop viewing federalism as a tactic and start using it as a principle. And both parties are incredible. It's a target-rich environment for hypocrisy. I mean, when Arizona enacted some pretty strict immigration restrictions during the Obama administration, and Obama sued to get rid of those restrictions, conservatives were saying federalism, federalism, federalism. And they were furious when the Supreme Court struck it down, and shared the Scalia dissent far and wide, saying Scalia gets it. And then the instant California enacts sanctuary state laws, they're like, forget federalism, we're going to file a lawsuit against California. And so time and time again, you go through a lot of these basic principles of American life, and what you'll see is they are principles that dissenters love and that the powerful often discard for larger purposes. And we have to get past that. We have to move past that. And I talk about cancel culture. On the right, everyone loves to point at left-wing cancel culture, but there's a live, vicious cancel culture on the right as well. And so it's like time and time again, you see people use principles as tactics and not as principles. And that hypocrisy is overwhelmingly obvious to people and deepens alienation and polarization.
You write a great Sunday column for the Dispatch talking about religion and how it intersects with politics, and it's been very influential for me as I've come back to the faith. And it's interesting around Brave Angels, and I think sometimes at the culture at large, you hear a lot of, we need to sort of get the love back into politics. We need a politics more of love, and we need to base everything more on love. And I think that can sound very abstract. So I'm curious for you as a Christian, but also as somebody who's received some pretty hateful, bilious pushback to some of your ideas and stances. What does love your enemies look like in practice?
Yeah.
And what might that teach even somebody who's secular in the political realm, in order to make these politics like a little bit more respectful?
Yeah, I think there's a few principles that come into play. And here's one that I think is really important, and one that I have seen build bonds of fellowship across immense differences. And I raise it in the book, and that is fight for the rights of others you would like to exercise yourself. That doesn't mean it's not fight for the rights of the people you agree with, or fight for the rights of your tribe. All of that just increases division. Fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. And one of the things that happens when you do that, when you extend yourself to defend the fundamental human rights and liberties of people that are across the aisle from you, there's a couple of things that happen. One, you tend to understand them better, because to defend them, you have to enter into their story to an extent. You have to understand their story. So you understand them better. And two, it builds really interesting and unique bonds of fellowship. And I've become a big believer in this principle because of my civil liberties work over the years, that I have defended people who disagree with me dramatically. And that has actually created bonds of friendship and fellowship. It humanizes people. So that's one way, I think, in a very real way, that you love your quote unquote enemies, your political opponents, is by defending their basic liberties and freedoms in the same way that you would defend your own. That sounds super basic, but it's also very, very, very powerful. The other thing is, look, I'm not perfect at any of this stuff. I'm just trying my best. But the other thing is, try as much as possible to target ideas and not people. If there's an idea that you disagree with the idea. But as much as possible, don't target people. Don't try to destroy human beings. And there's an awful lot of it's really interesting to me how one thing that I've seen happen in the media is it's not enough to defeat somebody in an argument. You have to then question why they even have a job. Oh, so-and-so is wrong. They need to be held accountable. Well, I mean, there is a kind of an accountability that should exist. Like if somebody commits libel or slander and they're in the media, or if they have been found to recklessly spread false information, all of these things are accountability measures that should occur. But the fact that I disagree with you, or the fact that in good faith you made a mistake, means that your career should be over and you should be sort of chased from a polite society, is really weird. I came into the world of media from the world of law. And if I was in a case litigating against my opposing counsel, I fervently wanted them to lose. But if I was fortunate enough to win a court case, they didn't immediately put out a press release and say, client vindicated now, law firm of Smith, Johnson, and Jones, fire your attorneys. And, this is sort of, we've gotten into this politics of personal destruction, to use a phrase from the 1990s. That is extremely toxic. So fight for the rights of others you would like to exercise yourself. Target ideas and not individuals. And then the other thing is, I think people really need to start kind of broadcasting humility in this sense, not saying, oh, look how humble I am, but saying things are hard. It is tough to know how to deal with the legacy of racial discrimination. It is hard to know how to deal with the challenge of Vladimir Putin. It is hard to know how to deal with economic inequality. I'm giving my best shot at it, but I need to hear from you. That's a concrete way in which you manifest humility, is by acknowledging the challenges are difficult. And I'm saying, in good faith, this is my best idea. But you know what? I don't just want to hear your best idea. I need it. Because unless I can hear your best idea, it's not testing mine. I don't know the ultimate value of mine. And so I think it's vitally important that we sort of adopt a posture of greater humility, in the sense that we look at the incredible complexity of the challenges we face and say, I know it's hard. This is my best shot. I want to hear your best shot. And ultimately, we got to make a decision. So somebody's going to be disappointed. But if you're going into it from a posture of good faith and openness, I think it makes a big difference.
You mentioned the power of leaders hesitating to use maximal power when they realize that doing so may actually further deepen the divisions that ultimately hurt us all. I wonder how you think about that in the context of the Supreme Court vacancy specifically, given that, Republicans are forging ahead, yet Republicans would likely say, Democrats would do the same in our place, and it would be unilateral disarmament not to do that. And then you have other folks saying, well, no, these norms are important, and this is kind of the final barrier being broken. So how do you think about that in kind of this intense real world test case?
Well, and I wrote about this in Time magazine a couple of weeks ago, and I proposed a compromise. And the compromise was, and it was based on actually the things that many Republican senators said back in the Merrick Garland battle, where they went well beyond saying, hey, we hold the Senate, and we just, through our constitutional advice and consent power, we don't consent. They basically said, hey, look, during an election, we should wait till the election occurs and hold us to it. That's what Lindsey Graham said, was hold me to it. And it wasn't just Lindsey Graham. Several Republican senators said, I would do the same thing if a Republican were president now. And so, it really deepens alienation and frustration when people are so transparently false. What's the principle in play? Are you just using words to disguise the pure Machiavellianism of the moment? It seems like it. So what I proposed was, nominate Amy Coney Barrett, hold hearings, then have the election. And if Trump wins, she's confirmed. If Trump loses, Mitch McConnell goes to the Democrats and says, in exchange for a compromise, say a promise not to pack the court, goes to specific Democrats. In exchange for a compromise, say a promise not to pack the courts, or something equivalent, we're going to allow Joe Biden to fill the seat. To me, that is balancing power and prudence in an important way. But right now, if the view is, I can do it, so I will do it, the limiting principle there is hard to see. And the increased escalation is hard to stop. And look, the Republicans may crow if they get Amy Coney Barrett on the court and the Democrats don't court pack right away, which they probably won't, to be honest. But here's what will happen. The threat of court packing will hang over the court like the sword of Damocles. And big hot button cases will go up. And if the Democrats hold the House and the Senate and the presidency, you will see people say, well, nice little 9-person court you got there. And so what you'll have is this constant escalation. And so, I think there are times when it has to be about more than doing what I can do.
Right.
It has to be, because if it's not, if the only limiting principle is the exercise of power, even if it's legal, adding states is legal, adding justices to the court is legal, ending the filibuster is legal. Not any of those things is constitutionally problematic. But if the rule is anything I can legally do, I'm gonna do, don't get ready for none of this to get any better.
So my last question, well, Greg, I can let you jump in, but my last question was about sort of the day after the election. So we have an initiative at Braver Angels called With Malice Toward None, and another one called Hold America Together. Hold America Together is predicated on what do we do in the context of a contested election. With Malice Toward None is what do we do when there's a victor and a loser, and you are either delighted or devastated. What would be your advice to Americans so that they can think about now how they react after the election? What would you say to them?
Well, here's one quick thing. you're going to have a huge number of Americans who are shocked and devastated. Shocked. And a key part of that phrase is shocked. Because look, I know that it's 9 points right now. The 538 average is like 8.8 or something like this. And that Trump, there's some polls indicating the bottom is falling out of Trump support. But we've still got a ways to go to the election. And I can tell you, I live in the middle of Trump country. An awful lot of people are absolutely 100% convinced he's going to win. All of this is fake. None of these polls are real. I mean, they might be right. It would be one of the biggest polling scandals in United States history if all of these are off that much, or polling fails, I should say, not scandals. Polling fails. But a lot of people are going to be shocked and devastated. Here's the last thing you should do. Don't spike the football. There's a difference between saying, I'm glad I won. I'm happy I won. We worked hard and enjoying a victory. And this sort of own the libs or, seeing your opponent destroyed. There should be an immediate effort. And America's best leaders have done this, an immediate effort at attempting reconciliation, attempting to be magnanimous in victory. So I think that's one of the things. I mean, it doesn't always work. I mean, I have on my desk a sign from a quote from Lincoln from his first inaugural. That's the key time. The first inaugural, where he says, "We must not be enemies, though passion may have strained, and must not break our bonds of affection." Didn't work.
Right.
But it was important to make the effort. And so I think that, that's one thing that is absolutely key. And then the other thing is don't overreach. One of the fascinating realities of American politics right now is that every overreaction is accompanied by an equal and opposite overreaction. I don't know where that fits in like Newton's laws, but what ends up happening is every time somebody wins, they feel like they have sort of solved the key. They figured it out. I know how to win elections now. There was a lot of confidence after Obama's 2012 victory where the phrase "the coalition of the ascendant" was used. And so there were a lot of assumptions based on sort of like we have a permanent majority. We figured all of this out. And so often then overreaching is followed by a backlash. I mean, Obama went from a filibuster-proof majority in 2008 to losing the House in 2010. That's a big reversal. And so a lot of this is if you're spiking the football, if you're overreaching, if you're not intentionally seeking to reach out and heal breaches that have occurred over the course of a tough campaign, you're just asking for it to keep going. And you're just asking for it to keep escalating. And then you're rolling the dice that you have, in fact, somehow figured out a key that, American demographics and American geography suggests that you probably haven't.
Well, David, thank you very much for your time today. This has been a wonderful conversation. The thrill for me is, as Ciaran mentioned, I'm known for flooding the Braver Angels Slack channel with your articles. So to be able to chat with you and pick your brain a little bit and hear more about your book, Divided We Fall, and your thoughts on polarization has been an honor. So thank you for making the time with us today.
Well, you're super kind to have me, and I really enjoyed the conversation. So thanks very much, y'all.
Me too. And I would just remind our listeners again, if you enjoyed this conversation, if you hated this conversation, let us know. We take compliments, we take criticism, we take suggestions for future guests. And please go to braverangels.org and consider signing the letter to hold America together. If you're feeling really energized, get 25 of your friends to sign. We are inviting millions of people to sign, and we're also lining up prominent folks, red and blue, to take a stand against violence and to try to hold together the union and help us build a house united. So over and out from Braver Angels. Thanks again, David, and hopefully talk to you again soon.
Thanks so much, y'all.